Well, next on our list of character qualifications that Paul gives to Titus is he said that a spiritual leader cannot be someone who is given to drunkenness. Now, actually, that's the NIV translation, and it's a pretty literal translation, pretty accurate. The King James says not given to drink, and that has led some people to conclude that if somebody has a glass of wine with their dinner, then they're in sin and disqualified from spiritual leadership. It's one of those questions that comes up because actually drinking has become much more prevalent in our culture than it was even when I was growing up. That even though my parents drank alcohol, it was infrequent. And even at times with our family, I mean, there was a lot of times where part of my mom's culture was that we would have wine with dinner, even when I was very young. And certainly we used it often for medicinal purposes. But I can say that I only saw my father drunk once, and it was not a pretty moment in my life. It was actually a pretty traumatic moment, and I never saw him touch alcohol after that. So that the idea of drinking was kind of not that as usual as we think it is, because most people couldn't really afford to drink alcohol with any kind of regularity. Today, that's very different. In fact, let's do a little bit of a word study on this, because the word drunkenness here is the Greek word methe, and it means literally habitual intoxication. In other words, someone who is, by their behavior, could be defined as a drunk or an alcoholic, or maybe more broadly, because I think today it is more broad, somebody who is addicted to substances. And by addicted, I mean that they basically rely upon some kind of substance in order to sustain themselves. And that's the problem with any kind of intoxicant. If you do it regularly enough, there comes a point where you become dependent upon it. And the best way you can tell if somebody's become dependent is if you take it away from them and they begin to have a mood change, or basically begin thinking about it and pursuing it, and that kind of fills their mind. One of the things I have to say, honestly, from a scriptural point of view, that I can't say to anybody that it's always wrong, absolutely wrong, or forbidden to drink alcohol. I know that there are people who hold that view, and I've read and even had those conversations, but I can't really defend that scripturally and say, well, you can never have a glass of wine with your wife or whatever. But at the same time, what is very clear in Scripture, it's said clearly, it's said repeatedly, and it's clearly prohibited, is the idea of intoxication, both in the Old and the New Testament. I mean, for example, in Proverbs 20, verse 1, Solomon said, wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. So again, he doesn't prohibit people from drinking, but he said, if you're led by it, in other words, it takes control of you. And that's why I say that if you feel that you have the liberty to drink, just really be aware and very cognizant of where does it take over and begin to take leadership of your thought life and your behavior, because that's a line that you should never go beyond. Now, for some of you, you have such a proclivity towards alcohol or substance abuse, you should never, ever, ever touch it, and your friends should never, ever drink around you. They should never invite you to, or I have a pastor friend of mine who said one time, he said, because he was a drug addict and an alcoholic before he was saved, he said, I would tell my congregation, if I come to your house, don't offer me a glass of wine, because if I take it, I will wake up in Montana 3 days later and not know how I got here. And so I'm just saying, you guys, those of you who know this is who you are, you need to own that and live by that and communicate to your friends and others that, hey, don't ever do this. I just don't think it's really a wise thing to be offering your guests alcohol, especially if you don't know their story or their history. But people always ask me, well, what about moderate drinking? And there again, I have to say, how do you define moderate? Because quite honestly, every person I've ever known who has a real problem with alcohol has always said, well, they drink moderately, or they drink occasionally. And occasionally means whenever there's an occasion, I drink. And so, it's, again, we can play these kind of word games, but the simple fact is that if something I do impairs my judgment, then it's something that I shouldn't do. When Paul said, I won't allow myself to be brought under the control or the power of anything, other than the Holy Spirit of God. That becomes a good measure. And frankly, I think we need to keep open ears to people around us, because if you have family or friends saying, when you start drinking, you tend to go too far. You do too much. You don't seem to be able to control that or moderate that. Then you need to listen carefully to it. And I just encourage people who have that issue to step away from all alcohol for a season in your life, whether it be a week, 2 weeks, a month. You'll find out how big an issue it is the minute you try to quit and control. And so there again, I can't say to people, well, you're in sin if you have a glass of wine. I mean, we do see that wine was and strong drink was part of the drink of the ancient world. We can make the argument as well that the alcohol content was not nearly as high. And that's part of why one of the definitions of drunkenness in scriptures, somebody who lingers long at wine, because, it had lower alcohol levels, so you had to drink a lot more of it over a longer period of time. But actually, for centuries, alcohol was used, especially wine was used to be mixed with water to kill off the bacteria. So that's what Paul was talking about when he said to Timothy, no longer drink the water, but drink a little wine for your stomach's sake. The point is that the water was oftentimes became susceptible to fecal matter because of the dung that was everywhere, and it would leach into the water systems, and people didn't understand bacteria. And epidemics would break out because people were drinking fecal or bacteria from the same well. And so as a result, they realized, somebody figured out sometime, if you put a little wine in there, basically it was a kind of a 1-to-4 relationship, that the chances of you getting sick were less. That's why I, in fact, explained to them the biggest distiller in America in the colonial days before the Revolutionary War was George Washington. And it was believed in that day that drinking liquor or alcohol or wine was healthier for you than drinking the water, for exactly the same reason I explained. So they found that people who just drank water tended to get sick and die much more quickly than people who didn't drink as much water and tended to drink alcohol. But at the same time, most people couldn't afford to just sit around drinking straight alcohol, because they understood that led to intoxication, and so they mixed it with water. Hence, we end up with the development of what we call mixed drinks. So the idea wasn't so that you could have some unique flavor. It was basically so that you could hydrate yourself without poisoning yourself because of the bacteria, the fecal matter, or whatever else happened to be in your water supply. Which brings me to one other question I get asked. Some people say, now that pot is legal, is it all right for me to smoke it? And I have to look at them and say, are you serious? I mean, you see, the whole idea of smoking pot is intoxication. I've never known a pot smoker who didn't find that they were affected mentally, physically. They were impaired in some way or another. And if nothing else, they just became less smart than before. So I don't think that you can smoke pot or use substances of that nature at all in moderation, because there's nothing moderate about it. You take one puff off a marijuana cigarette, and you're going to begin to feel the effects immediately right away. I can say that probably there are many people who can sit down and have a glass of wine and not become affected by it. Their judgment impaired. But the simple fact is that's not true when you talk about pot, even if it's legal. And actually, the legal argument is kind of specious, because now we know that it causes a significant amount of brain damage, especially in teenagers, but also it just shortens people's lives. People are concerned about smoking a cigarette because they don't want to get the tar into their lungs, and yet a marijuana cigarette has 100 times more particles that are harmful to your lungs in them, and so you're really just pursuing an early death. And I'll just tell you one more thing. When I was first saved, or right before I got saved, I was sitting around with a group of guys smoking pot. And one of the guys who came in was actually a heroin addict at the time. This kind of company I ran with. He walked in and said, "You guys are a bunch of addicts." And we all laughed. He said, "We're not addicts. We just smoke pot." And he said, "No, you're addicts." And we said, "No, we aren't." And so he said, "Then quit." And, we all looked at each other. Well, we'd quit, but we don't want to. But we could if we wanted to, but we don't want to. And he just shook his head and says, "You guys are addicts." And that was a really kind of a come to Jesus moment for me, because it was the first time in my life I suddenly realized this thing is controlling my life. And I got to figure out a way how to get away from that. And ultimately, it meant I needed to change a lot of relationships, because that activity kind of defined my relationship with most of my friends. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Take them or leave them. God bless you and go in His grace.